A Double Story, Chapter 14, the final chapter. The soldiers sent out by the king had no great difficulty in finding Agnes's father and mother, of whom they demanded if they knew anything of such a young princess as they described. The honest pair told them the truth in every point, that having lost their own child and found another, they had taken her home and treated her as their own. That she had indeed called herself a princess, but they had not believed her because she did not look like one. That even if they had, they did not know how they could have done differently, seeing they were very poor people who could not afford to keep any idle person about the place. That they had done their best to teach her good ways, and had not parted with her until her bad temper rendered her impossible to put up with her any longer. That as to the king's proclamation, they heard little of the world's news on their lonely hill, and it had never reached them. That if it had, they did not know how either of them could have gone such a distance from home and left their sheep or their cottage, one or the other, uncared for.
"You must learn then how both of you can go, and your sheep must take care of your cottage," said the lawyer, and commanded the soldiers to bind them hand and foot.
Heedless of their entreaties to be spared such an indignity, the soldiers obeyed, bore them to a cart, and set out for the king's palace, leaving the cottage door open, the fire burning, the pot of potatoes boiling upon it, the sheep scattered over the hill, and the dogs not knowing what to do. Hardly were they gone, however, before the wise woman walked up, with Prince behind her, peeped into the cottage, locked the door, put the key in her pocket, and then walked away up the hill. In a few minutes there arose a great battle between Prince and the dog which filled his former place, a well-meaning but dull fellow who could fight better than feed. Prince was not long in showing him that he was meant for his master. And then, by his efforts and directions to the other dogs, the sheep were soon gathered again and out of danger from foxes and bad dogs. As soon as this was done, the wise woman left them in charge of Prince, while she went to the next farm to arrange for the folding of the sheep and the feeding of the dogs. When the soldiers reached the palace, they were ordered to carry their prisoners at once into the presence of the king and queen in the throne room. Their 2 thrones stood upon a high dais at one end, and on the floor at the foot of the dais the soldiers laid their helpless prisoners. The queen commanded that they should be unbound, and ordered them to stand up. They obeyed with the dignity of insulted innocence, and their bearing offended their foolish majesties. Meantime the princess, after a long day's journey, arrived at the palace and walked up to the sentry at the gate.
"Stand back,"
said the sentry. "I wish to go in, if you please," said the princess gently.
"Ha, ha, ha!"
laughed the sentry, for he was one of those dull people who form their judgment from a person's clothes without even looking in his eyes. And as the princess happened to be in rags, her request was amusing, and the booby thought himself quite clever for laughing at her so thoroughly. "I am the princess," Rosamond said quietly.
"What princess?" bellowed the man.
"The Princess Rosamond. Is there another?" she answered and asked. But the man was so tickled at the wondrous idea of a princess in rags that he scarcely heard what she said for laughing. As soon as he recovered a little, he proceeded to chuck the princess under the chin, saying, "You're a pretty girl, my dear, though you ain't no princess." Rosamond drew back with dignity. "You have spoken 3 untruths at once," she said. "I am not pretty, and I am a princess, and if I were dear to you, as I ought to be, you would not laugh at me because I am badly dressed, but stand aside and let me go to my father and mother." The tone of her speech and the rebuke she gave him made the man look at her. And looking at her, he began to tremble inside his foolish body and wonder whether he might not have made a mistake. He raised his hand in salute and said, "I beg your pardon, miss, but I have express orders to admit no child whatever within the palace gates. They tell me His Majesty the King says he is sick of children." He may well be sick of me, thought the princess, but it can't mean that he does not want me home again. I don't think you can very well call me a child, she said, looking at the sentry full in the face.
You ain't very big, miss, answered the soldier. But so be you say you ain't a child, I'll take the risk. The king can only kill me, and a man must die once.
He opened the gate, stepped aside, and allowed her to pass. Had she lost her temper, as everyone but the wise woman would have expected of her, he certainly would not have done so. She ran into the palace, the door of which had been left open by the porter when he followed the soldiers and prisoners to the throne room, and bounded up the stairs to look for her father and mother. As she passed the door of the throne room, she heard an unusual noise in it, and running to the king's private entrance, over which hung a heavy curtain, she peeped past the edge of it, and saw to her amazement the shepherd and shepherdess standing like culprits before the king and queen, and the same moment heard the king say, "Peasants, where is the Princess Rosamond?" "Truly, sire, we do not know," answered the shepherd.
"You ought to know," said the king.
"Sire, we could keep her no longer."
"You confess, then," said the king, suppressing the outbreak of the wrath that boiled up in him, "that you turned her out of your house."
For the king had been informed by a swift messenger of all that had passed long before the arrival of the prisoners. "We did, sire, but not only could we keep her no longer, but we knew not that she was the princess."
"You ought to have known the moment you cast your eyes upon her," said the king. "Anyone who does not know a princess the moment he sees her ought to have his eyes put out."
"Indeed he ought," said the queen. To this they returned no answer, for they had none ready.
"Why did you not bring her at once to the palace?" pursued the king, "whether you knew her to be a princess or not? My proclamation left nothing to your judgment. It said every child."
"We heard nothing of the proclamation, sire."
"You ought to have heard," said the king. "It is enough that I make proclamations. It is for you to read them. Are they not written in letters of gold upon the brazen gates of this palace?"
"A poor shepherd, your majesty. How often must he leave his flock and go hundreds of miles to look whether there may be something in letters of gold upon the brazen gates? We did not know that your majesty had made a proclamation, or even that the princess was lost."
"You ought to have known," said the king.
The shepherd held his peace. "But," said the queen, taking up the word, "all that is as nothing when I think how you misused the darling." The only ground the queen had for saying thus was what Agnes had told her as to how the princess was dressed, and her condition seemed to the queen so miserable that she had imagined all sorts of oppression and cruelty. But this was more than the shepherdess, who had not yet spoken, could bear. "She would have been dead, and not buried, long ago, madam, if I had not carried her home in my 2 arms."
"Why does she say her 2 arms?" said the king to herself. "Has she more than 2? Is there treason in that?"
"You dressed her in cast-off clothes," said the queen. "I dressed her in my own sweet child's Sunday clothes, and this is what I get for it," cried the shepherdess, bursting into tears.
"And what did you do with the clothes you took off her? Sell them?"
"Put them in the fire, madam, for they were not fit for the poorest child in the mountains. They were so ragged that you could see her skin through them in 20 different places."
"You cruel woman, to torture a mother's feelings so!"
cried the queen, and in her turn burst into tears. "And I'm sure," sobbed the shepherdess, "I took every pains to teach her what was right for her to know. I taught her to tidy the house and—" "Tidy the house!" moaned the queen. "My poor wretched offspring! And peel the potatoes and—"
"Peel the potatoes!" cried the queen. "Oh, horror!"
"And black her master's boots," said the shepherdess.
"Black her master's boots!" shrieked the queen. "Oh, my white-handed princess! Oh, my ruined baby!" "What I want to know," said the king, paying no heed to this maternal duel, but patting the top of his sceptre as if it had been the hilt of a sword which he was about to draw, "is where the princess is now."
The shepherd made no answer, for he had nothing to say more than he had said already.
"You have murdered her," shouted the king. "You shall be tortured till you confess the truth, and then you shall be tortured to death, for you are the most abominable wretches in the whole wide world."
"Who accuses me of crime?" cried the shepherd, indignant.
"I accuse you," said the king, "but you shall see face to face the chief witness to your villainy. Officer, bring the girl."
Silence filled the hall while they waited. The king's face was swollen with anger. The queen hid hers behind her handkerchief. The shepherd and shepherdess bent their eyes on the ground, wondering. It was with difficulty Rosamond could keep her place, but so wise had she already become that she saw it would be far better to let everything come out before she interfered. At length the door opened, and in came the officer, followed by Agnes, looking white as death and mean as sin. The shepherdess gave a shriek and darted toward her with arms spread wide. The shepherd followed, but not so eagerly. "My child, my lost darling, my Agnes!" cried the shepherdess.
"Hold them asunder," shouted the king. "Here is more villainy. What, have I a scullery maid in my house born of such parents? The parents of such a child must be capable of anything. Take all three of them to the rack. Stretch them till their joints are torn asunder, and give them no water. Away with them."
The soldiers approached to lay hands on them. But behold, a girl, all in rags, with such a radiant countenance that it was right lovely to see, darted between, and, careless of the royal presence, flung herself upon the shepherdess, crying, "Do not touch her! She is my good kind mistress." But the shepherdess could hear or see no one but her Agnes, and pushed her away. Then the princess turned, with the tears in her eyes, to the shepherd, and threw her arms about his neck, and pulled down his head, and kissed him. And the tall shepherd lifted her to his bosom, and kept her there. But his eyes were fixed on his Agnes.
"What is the meaning of this?" cried the king, starting up from his throne. "How did that ragged girl get in here? Take her away with the rest. She is one of them too."
But the princess made the shepherd set her down, and before anyone could interfere she had run up the steps of the dais, and then the steps of the king's throne like a squirrel, flung herself upon the king, and began to smother him with kisses. All stood astonished, except the three peasants, who did not even see what took place. The shepherdess kept calling to her Agnes, but she was so ashamed that she did not dare even lift her eyes to meet her mother's, and the shepherd kept gazing on her in silence. As for the king, he was so breathless and aghast with astonishment that he was too feeble to fling the ragged child from him, as he tried to do. But she left him, and running down the steps of the one throne and up those of the other, began kissing the queen next. But the queen cried out, "Get away, you great rude child! Will nobody take her to the rack?" Then the princess, hardly knowing what she did, for joy that she had come in time, ran down the steps of the throne and the dais, and placing herself between the shepherd and shepherdess, took a hand of each and stood looking at the king and queen. Their faces began to change. At last they began to know her, but she was so altered, so lovelily altered, that it was no wonder that they should not have known her at the first glance. But it was the fault of the pride and anger and injustice with which their hearts were filled that they did not know her at the second. The king gazed, and the queen gazed, both half risen from their thrones, and looking as if about to tumble down upon her, if only they could be right sure that the ragged girl was their own child. A mistake would be such a dreadful thing. "My darling!" at last shrieked the mother a little doubtfully. "My pet of pets?" cried the father with an interrogative twist of tone. Another moment, and they were halfway down the steps of the dais. "Stop!" said a voice of command from somewhere in the hall, and king and queen as they were, they stopped at once halfway, then drew themselves up, stared, and began to grow angry again, but durst not go farther. The wise woman was coming slowly up through the crowd that filled the hall. Everyone made way for her. She came straight on until she stood in front of the king and queen. "Miserable man and woman," she said in words they alone could hear, "I took your daughter away when she was worthy of such parents. I bring her back, and they are unworthy of her. That you did not know her when she came to you is a small wonder, for you have been blind in soul all your lives. Now be blind in body until your better eyes are unsealed." She threw her cloak open, it fell to the ground, and the radiance that flashed from her robe of snowy whiteness, from her face of awful beauty, and from her eyes that shone like pools of sunlight, smote them blind. Rosamond saw them give a great start, shudder, waver to and fro, then sit down on the steps of the dais, and she knew they were punished, but knew not how. She rushed up to them, and catching a hand of each, said, "Father, dear father, mother dear, I will ask the wise woman to forgive you." "Oh, I am blind, I am blind," they cried together, "dark as night, stone blind." Rosamond left them, sprang down the steps, and kneeling at her feet, cried, "Oh, my lovely wise woman, do let them see. Do open their eyes, dear, good, wise woman." The wise woman bent down to her and said, so that none else could hear, "I will one day. Meanwhile, you must be their servant as I have been yours. Bring them to me, and I will make them welcome." Rosamond rose, went up the steps again to her father and mother, where they sat like statues with closed eyes, halfway from the top of the dais where stood their empty thrones, seated herself between them, took a hand of each, and was still. All this time very few in the room saw the wise woman. The moment she threw off her cloak, she vanished from the sight of almost all who were present. The woman who swept and dusted the hall and brushed the throne saw her, and the shepherd had a glimmering vision of her, but no one else that I know of caught a glimpse of her. The shepherdess did not see her, nor did Agnes, but she felt her presence upon her, like the beat of a furnace 7 times heated. As soon as Rosamond had taken her place between her father and mother, the wise woman lifted her cloak from the floor, threw it again around her. Then everybody saw her, and Agnes felt as if a soft, dewy cloud had come between her and the torrid rays of a vertical sun. The wise woman turned to the shepherd and shepherdess. "For you," she said, "you are sufficiently punished by the work of your own hands. Instead of making your daughter obey you, you left her to be a slave to herself. You coaxed when you ought to have compelled, you praised when you ought to have been silent, you fondled when you ought to have punished. You threatened when you ought to have inflicted, and there she stands, the full-grown result of your foolishness. She is your crime and your punishment. Take her home with you and live hour after hour with the pale-hearted disgrace you call your daughter. What she is, the worm at her heart has begun to teach her. When life is no longer endurable, come to me." "Madam," said the shepherd, "may I not go with you now?" "You shall," said the wise woman. "Husband, husband," cried the shepherdess, "how are we two to get home without you?" "I will see to that," said the wise woman, "but little of home you will find it until you have come to me. The king carried you hither, and he shall carry you back, but your husband shall not go with you. He cannot now if he would." The shepherdess looked and saw that the shepherd stood in a deep sleep. She went to him and sought to rouse him, but neither tongue nor hands were of the slightest avail. The wise woman turned to Rosamond. "My child," she said, "I shall never be far from you. Come to me when you will. Bring them to me." Rosamond smiled and kissed her hand, but kept her place by her parents. They also were now in a deep sleep like the shepherd. The wise woman took the shepherd by the hand and led him away. And that is all my double story. How double it is, if you care to know, you must find out. If you think it is not finished, I never knew a story that was. I could tell you a great deal more concerning them all, but I have already told more than is good for those who read but with their foreheads, and enough for those whom it has made look a little solemn and sigh as they close the book. And that is the end of A Double Story by George MacDonald. Keep watching for more stories. They're coming.